Great. Thanks very much. Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, that's great. I have a bit of a cold, so I'm sorry if I'm a bit quiet, but I'll try and be loud. Okay. So I thought I would open with a little joke, because that's always a good way to start, isn't it? I went looking for a couple of sexist jokes to set the scene. Some of them, most of them, were not really appropriate for an event put on by the Christian Union, but I found one that was okay, so here you go. Why aren't there any women astronauts? Because the moon doesn't need cleaning. Yeah, I know. It's not funny, naturally. But ultimately, that's often what we think of when we're asked to consider sexism from our perspective as 21st century Westerners. Sexism is just bad jokes about making sandwiches or snide comments about sporting ability. But surely it's not anything more than that. We're clear, I suppose, that the situation is a bit different in other parts of the world. So there are places where girls are prohibited from getting an education, going to school, or women are banned from driving or voting or other things. But here in the UK, everything's fine, right? Well, I'd like to suggest that that isn't actually the case. In this country, we have had laws to allow women to vote since 1928, and laws to require equal pay for women since 1970. But we still live in a society where a national newspaper publishes pictures of half-naked women 5 days a week. We have had a woman Prime Minister, but currently in the House of Parliament there are 144 female MPs and 500 male MPs. Around 85,000 women are raped every year in the UK, and a report published a week ago stated that 1/3 of women in the EU have experienced abuse at the hands of men, whether physical or sexual, a statistic which equates to around 62 million people. In 1970, Germaine Greer's famous treatise, The Female Eunuch, was published. When it was reprinted a generation later, she wrote a new preface explaining that her kind of original intention and desire for the book was that it would become outdated and unnecessary. She had hoped that the world would change and that feminist ideals that she had portrayed would have become a reality. Unfortunately, though the world has changed since the 1970s, the call that she made then still hasn't been satisfied, namely freedom for women. Despite the freedom to vote and the freedom to earn a fair wage, to name a couple of things that have been fought for and won in the last 100 years, women are not free from objectification or harassment or rape or other forms of violence. We live in a world that is sexist because, by and large, men are stronger than women. So despite the fact that we live in a society with many laws in place to provide protection for women, the reality of the situation is that they can't. Laws alone can't protect women and provide freedom. Rather, they just punish after the fact, which isn't really of very much use or comfort. The overwhelming assumption in this country, at least, is that the sexist baggage that our culture is carrying is due to our Christian past. We look back on 1,000 or more years of history as a country, and it is steeped in both sexism and Christianity, so surely they must be linked. It's widely assumed that Christians, Christianity, and God himself are all sexist. And the question I'm here to answer is that correct? Does God really want all women barefoot, pregnant, and chained to the kitchen sink? I think it's necessary to acknowledge that some Christians and some people purporting to be Christians have been and are guilty of varying degrees of sexism. Often they've used the Bible as an excuse for that attitude, and I'm going to go into a little bit of detail as to whether that's actually a correct understanding of the Bible in a moment. But before, I think we need to ask an earlier and slightly more basic question: is sexism wrong? So let's look at Germaine Greer again. In her introduction to the 21st century edition to The Female Eunuch, she made the following statement regarding her initial call for freedom for women. The freedom I pleaded for 20 years ago was freedom to be a person with the dignity, integrity, nobility, passion, pride that constitute personhood. Freedom to run, shout, to talk loudly and sit with your knees apart. Freedom to know and love the earth and all that swims, lies and crawls upon it. Freedom to learn and freedom to teach. Freedom from fear, freedom from hunger, freedom of speech and freedom of belief. Most of the women in the world are still afraid, still hungry, still mute and loaded by religion with all kinds of fetters, masked, muzzled, mutilated and beaten. The first sentence is key, so I'm just going to read it again. She said, "The freedom I pleaded for 20 years ago was freedom to be a person with the dignity, integrity, nobility, passion, pride that constitute personhood. On the face of it, it sounds perfectly reasonable. Most of us, as we hear those words, will say, yeah, I agree with that. For the thinking human, there is no real question. Women are as much people as men are. And so her call for freedom is not just reasonable, but it's instinctively good and true and right. But the question that needs to be asked is this: what basis does she or any of us have for demanding that freedom of personhood? We're so used to hearing about rights and freedoms. Everyone is entitled to various things: freedom of speech and expression, access to water and shelter and healthcare and education. But why? What's the reason for that? Now, please don't mishear me. I'm not saying women shouldn't have all of these rights, this freedom and dignity. But the question is, why? Where do we get this notion from? Where is it written that women should expect the same freedoms as men? Greer is an atheist, and I think it would be fair to say, although I'm happy to be challenged, that she would consider any form of religion to be, at the very least, inclined towards sexism. To have true freedom as a woman, one needs to throw off the burden of religion and its oppression. However, what does an atheist worldview say to this question of a basis for rights? Let me just briefly quote Richard Dawkins in his book River Out of Eden. He said, "The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." That's how Dawkins sees the world that we live in. It's a place where things work, but there's no higher or greater purpose behind them, which is all well and good until one wants to make a demand for rights or wrongs, for that matter. In Dawkins' universe, there's no place for us to say that sexism is wrong. There's no place for us to say that rape is evil. It just is. If our only basis for understanding the universe is that the strong survive, then feminism doesn't have a leg to stand on. The strong win the day, and the weak do as they're told, or face the consequences. And the reality of the situation is that, by and large, men are stronger than women. If you hold to an atheist worldview, then you're going to have a hard time trying to explain why you think that feminist arguments hold any weight. Atheism, when taken to its logical, if extreme conclusion, permits a continuation of a sexist agenda where the strong men are the victors and the weak women better shut up and do as they're told. Now, please don't mishear me. I'm not saying that if you're an atheist, that is what you think. I'm not saying that that's your view. I'm sure that it isn't. But it is the logical implication of the atheist worldview, and it leaves little room for calls for freedom and rights. Now, it might be said that Christianity holds the same sexist view, men walking over downtrodden women, but in actual fact, the Bible offers a starkly different view. In Genesis chapter 1, the very beginning of the Bible, we're presented with a poem that illustrates the creation of the world. The climax of that description comes as the creation of humanity is detailed, and these words are spoken. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. This is the beginning of the Bible, the beginning of humanity, and it's made clear that God has made both men and women in his image. God didn't just make men in his image, or generic humanity in his image, but rather male and female. That's the first imperative to equality of status, and it's pretty key. In this declaration, we see the only basis for equality between the sexes, and in fact, the basis for Western civilization, democracy, personhood, equality, and dignity, which is founded on this kind of biblical story of reality and a Judeo-Christian worldview. Let's take an example of another campaigner for freedom and rights, Martin Luther King Jr. When he was confronting racism in the US, he made numerous speeches where he invoked God's moral law and scripture as the basis for an end to discrimination. Whilst King was imprisoned in Birmingham, Alabama, he wrote a letter to a number of white church leaders to confront them on their attitudes. You can find it online, so you can read it for yourself if you'd like to. King called on them to recognise what the Bible really teaches and to therefore be genuinely true to their beliefs. For the King, the answer to racism in the South was not less Christianity, but a deeper, truer Christianity. And I like to argue that the same thing can be said for sexism. In the same way that some Christians in the US needed to see that they were failing to live in line with the faith that they said that they had with regard to race, there are a number of Christians who need to see the same thing with regard to gender. But let me just emphasise that point again. This first imperative to equality comes from the very first chapter of the Bible, this call that people, both male and female, have been created in God's image. I'm going to come to the second one a little bit later on. Now, of course, it's fair and right to acknowledge that Christians throughout history haven't always behaved as if what I've just said is true. Women have often been subjugated and oppressed over the years in societies that would label themselves as Christian, as well as those that wouldn't. But I think if we want to understand what Christianity is really all about, then we need to look at the one on whom the whole thing is based, and that's Jesus Christ. In the Bible, there are 4 biographies of Jesus' life. They're eyewitness accounts that are usually referred to as the Gospels, and they tell us lots of information about what Jesus did and said, and the way that he interacted with various different groups and individuals. First century Israel and Palestine, where Jesus lived and worked, was not a culture that was particularly friendly to women. They were seen as less than men in pretty much every way. Education was unavailable. They were unable to provide witness or testimony in a court because their word wasn't considered trustworthy or useful. They were discouraged from public gatherings where they would have to interact with men who weren't immediate family members. And they were usually treated as little more than property. They were useful to their fathers as a bride price, and they were useful to a husband to provide him with sons. There's an old Jewish prayer that was probably used by men around about the same time as Jesus, and it was recited every morning, and it said something along the lines of, "I thank you, God, that you have not made me a Gentile, a slave, or a woman." Women were objects, they were property, they were less than persons, and against this backdrop, Jesus' treatment of women is startlingly countercultural. There are loads of stories that I could tell you to illustrate my point, but I've picked one that I thought was especially appropriate, bearing in mind the title of the talk. You can read it for yourself in Luke's Gospel. There, I think, are some available near you. So it's on chapter 10, and it's on page 78. But I'm just going to tell it to you now, so you don't need to drag it out or anything like that. In the story, we're told that Jesus is having dinner with some friends. Lazarus, who's now kind of famous for dying and being brought back to life by Jesus, and his 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. In the account, we're told that Martha was busy serving. We can assume it was a fairly big dinner. There were a lot of guests, lots to do. Jesus was already pretty famous by this point, so there would have been no shortage of people accepting an invitation to come and see him, plus a number of people who would have just stopped by the house to catch a sight of the local celebrity. So with all of these guests, Martha is pretty busy. She's rushing around. She's obviously a little bit stressed out. It seems like she might be the only woman amongst a really large group of men. And in that culture, way, way more than ours, the women did the domestic work and the men literally lounged around the table waiting for stuff to be brought to them. However, it turns out that she isn't actually the only woman there. Her sister Mary is there too. But rather than rushing into helping serve, Mary is out with the men, sitting at Jesus' feet and learning from him. Now, that might not seem like a big deal to us, but for this culture, what's going on is just totally bizarre. Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet like a disciple. She's amongst the men, something that is inappropriate to the point of scandal. And maybe we could just say, well, it's a mistake. Perhaps she's hiding behind one of the men and Jesus hasn't noticed that she's there. Or maybe he has noticed, but he's kind of uncomfortable with the idea of making a scene. It would be a bit awkward, so he just ignores her, carries on teaching. And I suppose we could leave thinking that, but then the story keeps going. Martha comes over to Jesus with a complaint. She's busy and she's rushed, and will he please tell Mary to stop learning from him and get back into the kitchen where she belongs? No. This is how Jesus responds. He says, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her." The culture said that women were only good for the kitchen. Jesus said, no, it's better for you to come and be with me. There are plenty of other examples of the way that Jesus' treatment of women stood out against the culture of the day, and that example had an immense impact on the shape of the early church. Those early Christians treated women in a way that was stark in its contrast to the oppression of the surrounding culture. It both took care of women when society caused them to be vulnerable, and also freed them to be people in their own right, most obviously in the area of marriage. Culture required women to marry, usually against their will, to provide money for their fathers and children for their husband. But the church gave the opportunity for women to remain single or to marry, but by their choice. The point was that in either scenario, they weren't silent objects to be passed from one to another, but living, breathing, speaking, thinking people who could decide for themselves and serve God as individuals in their own right, rather than just as a tag-along. It's worth noting as well that the earliest roots of feminism came from Christians. These women and men recognised the truth that both male and female were created by God in his image, and that both male and female were invited to receive what Jesus offered. Later in that Gospel of Luke, we're told that Jesus, though innocent, is put on trial, is tortured and beaten and executed in a really brutal manner. After he dies, he rises again, and his empty grave is seen, first of all, by a group of women, despite the fact that their testimony to the fact would have been considered invalid by the courts. There's a quote from the author Dorothy Sayers from her essay, Are Women Human? She says, "Perhaps it's no wonder that the women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. There had never been such another. A prophet and teacher who never nagged at them, who never flattered or coaxed or patronised, who never made arch jokes about them, never treated them as either the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, who rebuked without querulousness and praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine or jeered at them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took them as he found them and was completely unself-conscious. There is no act, no sermon, no parable in the whole gospel that borrows its pugnancy from female perversity. Nobody could possibly guess from the words of Jesus that there was anything funny about women's nature." Jesus later appears in human form to many people and explains what has happened and why. The point of this, his death and resurrection, wasn't just a cool magic trick or a demonstration of power in and of itself. No, there's a purpose in it all, and that is to save people. We've already seen that the world that we live in is corrupt. Despite God's design of harmony and equality, we live in a world of corruption and oppression. To use just the examples that come from this one issue of sexism, we can see that women around the world are subjected to the institutional oppression of governments who discriminate against them, and then also the individual oppression which comes at the violent hands of strangers and family. We live in a world and country and cities where domestic violence and sexual assault are a daily reality. And even if we're not guilty of being the oppressors in these particular scenarios, I'm unable to say, and my guess is that you can't either, that we've lived a life of total perfection. Our default is towards corruption. Feminism actually offers a really perfect example of this. We see it in a lot of similar struggles. What has begun with a desire for equality quickly shifts for some. Feminism has stopped being about women being allowed equal rights and has moved to women being the victors whilst men are trodden down for a change. This is our default, but Jesus came and died and rose again to put that right, to take the punishment that we deserve, to reconcile our relationships to one another, men and women, and to God. Anne Stagg, who's a lady who led a party of women to campaign Parliament during the Civil War, was asked by the men who she was bringing her petition to why she, a woman, was getting involved. And she made a speech which contained this line. She said, "Christ purchased women at as dear a price as he did men." Ultimately, that's the answer. God created both men and women in his image, and Jesus Christ went to the cross for both men and women. That reconciled relationship made possible by Jesus' death and resurrection isn't offered differently to men than to women. All of us are equally human, and all of us are equally invited to know God. It's an invitation that's not based on the body parts we're equipped with or the chromosomes we possess, but based entirely on the work of one man, Jesus, all for us. Go back to that old Jewish prayer again. We can see it undone in the words of one of the letters that make up the New Testament portion of the Bible. As Paul, rather than thanking God that he is not a Gentile or a slave or a woman, instead declares that there is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female, because all are one in Christ. So, does God want women in the kitchen? No. He wants them with him, learning from him, listening to him, and accepting the offer of the relationship which he bought for them at such a very high price. Jesus offers a relationship which frees women from the discrimination and objectification that's thrust upon them by society. and enables them to find ultimate satisfaction in discovering who they really are. People made in the image of a good God, with all the dignity, nobility, passion and pride that implies, and all of the potential to create and work and love and live that promises. Okay, we're going to take some questions now, but first there's like a couple of minutes just to collect your thoughts, maybe text a question if you haven't already done it. There's also one of these response cards which everybody should have. Just while we're kind of thinking of questions and so on, could you also just fill in the card? Everyone's going to fill it in. If you maybe have a comment about the type of chair that you're sitting on, the food, you didn't like my accent, something like that, that's fine. You could write that down, your information. But then also, if you would like to find out more, there are boxes that you can tick. And so you could do that now. If you do tick one of those boxes, please do leave your number. And then in a couple of minutes, we're going to do questions, and it'll be finished by 10:02, so you can go to class.
All right then, guys. We're just going to start off with a question that's been texted in during the talk. The first question is, why were the disciples all men?
Okay. So, good question. Why were the disciples all men? So, just a slight kind of clarification, I guess. Jesus has 12 guys who, in particular, he hangs around with, sometimes referred to as disciples or apostles. Those guys were all men. I think the reason for that is mostly to do with the culture of the day. Reality was that there's no way that women could have done what the men did, which is essentially to give up their homes and jobs and everything and spend 3 years like wandering around Israel and like sleeping outside and stuff like that, because the society at the time didn't permit women to do anything like that. They would have had stuff to do at home, and they would have maybe had children, and they would have had husbands, and it just was not possible in that society, in that culture. What I think is really key is that even though that's what culture said, Jesus was totally countercultural with regard to the way that he dealt with women. So he did invite women to come and learn from him and be part of that kind of big crowd, as we saw in the story of Mary and Martha. And also just he spoke to women, and he had conversations and contact with them that was just really against the way that things work. They weren't seen by him as less than. There's evidence to suggest that a few of the women in particular, Mary Magdalene, who you might have heard of, not a prostitute, even though people think she was. She wasn't. She was just a rich lady. And actually, probably she gave quite a lot of money to kind of keep Jesus fed over the 3 years that he was hanging around along with his disciples and stuff. And so she was kind of his benefactor, I guess. And that there was a real place for women in his relationships in his society in a way that just wasn't part of the culture. But yeah, I think for a woman to be one of his 12 disciples would have just been impossible in the society that they were part of. Hopefully that answers the question. Does anybody have one from the floor? No? Okay. Do you want to take another one from the text?
Another one's coming is, why is God viewed as a he if both men and women are equal under God? It's very polite as well. It says thanks.
Okay, great. Lovely. Why is God referred to as a he? Okay, so there are instances in the Bible where God is given both male and female characteristics. So primarily, I guess, we see God is described as a father, which is obviously a male what's the word? But in other places, God is described as like a mother hen who gathers her chicks underneath her. And I'm trying to think of other good examples. I can't really think of any. Oh yeah, no, I can. There's a book called the Book of Proverbs, which is kind of all about wisdom and kind of like wise sayings and stuff like that. In that book, there's a character in the book who's called Lady Wisdom, and that figure is God. So there you go. God is not always male. Primarily father. And I guess also the reality is that we have a language that you kind of have to pick one. So, and he is often the shorthand. Otherwise you'd spend your entire life going he, she, which is weird and takes longer. So I think that's part of it. But I think it's really clear to see that if both male and female are created in God's image, then therefore God must necessarily be both masculine and feminine, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. So that would be my answer. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Would anybody like to come back on it or ask a different question? Sure. So the question was, Jesus was fine to women, but what about the Apostle Paul? He seems to be less so, and sort of talk about head coverings. So Paul, bless him, gets a little bit of a reputation as being like a bit of a monster, which I feel bad about because I don't think that's true. One of my examples in what I was saying was that he has kind of undone that old Jewish prayer of, thank God I'm not a slave, a Gentile, or a woman, and he made this famous statement where he basically, the suggestion that he was deliberately doing it, he knew the Jewish prayer and he's kind of undoing it in that statement where he says there's no longer Greek or Gentile or Jew, slave or free, male or female, all are one in Christ. And so there's this kind of equality that he sort of affirms. There are some things in Paul's writings that some would say are a bit sexist. You gave the example of head coverings. So there's a bit where it basically says women in church should cover up their heads because it's like a disgrace to have it uncovered. It's a little bit unclear as to what he means by that, partly because the language is quite confusing, and so it's even a bit unclear as to whether he means they should have a hat or whether they should have long hair, because of the way that he's written it. It's a bit vague. Partly, I think we would say that there's a kind of cultural understanding of what's going on, that actually probably in the society of the time, women who basically wore their hair long and free and flowing, the reason they did that was because they were prostitutes and they were kind of essentially flaunting their wares with their hair, which is weird, but there you go. You get it in like adverts, don't you, sometimes, where like, I think it's like the Diet Coke advert where she used to like pull her hair out and it all tumbled down, and that was like, oh my goodness, I'm ready now. Weird. Anyway, so it's like a flirty thing, okay? So there's an implication that that's what's going on, and therefore he's saying actually that's not really appropriate for church, because even though you're free to do whatever you want to, it's a bit distracting, and so could you cover up your heads so that you don't like make all the guys think of prostitutes? Maybe that's what's going on, maybe it's not. But basically what I'm saying is I don't think Paul was a sexist or a misogynist or anything like that, that actually particularly the stuff on marriage and the fact that he gave women in the early church the right to say, I'd like to be single to serve God, that is hugely countercultural to the time that they were in. Because actually, for women, you didn't get a choice. You didn't get to decide whether you got married or not. It was literally, here you are, you're being married off to this random guy, and you've got to give him children, and you've got to that's your life. And actually Paul was saying, no, you're a person, you're free to do what you'd like to. If you'd like to get married because you love somebody, great, but if you'd like to stay single and serve God in your own right, then you're free to do that as well. And I think that's huge. So I'm on Paul's side, basically, is what I'm saying. Does that help? Great. Do we want to go for anybody else? Or another one from the text?
Next one is, what is the symbolic meaning of Eve being made out of Adam's ribs?
I was going to see if I was going to make a joke then, but I think I won't, because I can't really remember it, so I won't. I think what it's about is about saying that we're connected. So God makes Adam out of the dust, and then he takes a rib from Adam and he makes Eve out of the rib. And I think the point of that is actually we are made to be together. So obviously the kind of classic example is in marriage, finding your other half, the missing rib or whatever that is. But bigger than that is this idea of actually that, no man is an island, that actually we are made for relationships with other people, that we're made to have community, and that's a good thing. And then also, and I think this is really clear that, and I think this is the clear message of the Bible, that actually one of the best things about community is that no person has the kind of capacity to do everything. We all have our own kind of gifts and things that we're better at than other people. And actually part of the community thing, and particularly in that kind of male and female relationship in marriage, is that you make up for what the other one lacks. So there's this kind of actually the things that, so I am like really bad at maths and science. I think science is magic. So if the world were just run by me, there would be no light or fire or anything. We would just be sitting in the dark because I can't understand anything that's scientific or mathematical. So I need people around who can make all of those things work, but I'm quite good at knitting. So if we didn't have me, none of you would have jumpers. This is what I'm saying. So we make up for what the other lacks. I think that's what the rib's about. Hopefully that makes sense. Would anybody like to come back on me about that? Yeah, so just for the benefit of the tape, or those who didn't hear, there's a word that's used to describe Eve in the first couple of chapters. It's a Hebrew word, it's ezer, it means helper. The only other place it's used in the Bible is to describe God, the Spirit who comes and helps people. So it's not a negative helper, but a really strong she that is there to help him and allow him to kind of exist, I guess, and function and so on. Okay? Anybody else from the floor, or we go to another text? Yeah? Okay, so the question was about the roots of feminism coming from earlier than Christ, so the Buddha talking about equality, and so whether my statement that feminism comes from Christianity is accurate. I don't really know a lot about Buddhism, so I'm kind of having to sort of say, yeah, okay, fine. I would say, I guess just that the kind of contrast particularly with the kind of society that Jesus and the kind of early church was working in, so kind of Roman, Greek kind of society, they're totally not like that. So actually, equality, not even just amongst the sexes, but actually amongst people in general, that there are certain people who are held as these are the highest, and everyone else is rubbish in comparison to them. And so kind of, this sort of Greek idea of democracy, where actually this, it's like everyone gets to have a vote. That's not what Greek democracy was like. Certain people got to have a vote, and other people could shut up, and particularly women could shut up. And so I think, I guess probably a particular kind of idea of the sort of feminism that we have as it is today. So kind of, we're kind of in sort of third wave, fourth wave feminism. First wave feminism, particularly the sort of voting rights, the suffragettes, that sort of feminism. The majority of the people who were involved in that, both men and women, were Christians, and were the reason that they were claiming the kind of this need for equality came out of their understanding of the Bible and Christianity. But thanks for your question. Should we go for another text one?
We've probably got time for one more. This one says, the Bible says, he that finds a wife finds a good thing. Does this not show that women are still seen as objects to men?
Okay. So, partly want to say, that sounds like a fairly reasonable thing to me. Here you are, guys. If you find a wife, that's good. I don't really see what there is to argue about that, because that seems like it's happy. You're getting married. Well done, you. Love and romance and so on and so forth. So I'm not totally sure where that's from, but I'm going to guess the Old Testament, and I'm going to guess Proverbs, maybe. But does anybody who asked the question want to nod at me or something? Well, whatever. That's what I'm guessing. Okay. And there's a big thing at the end of Proverbs, which this kind of poem towards this wife who's the greatest wife in all the world, basically, and she's so beautiful. But majorly, she is everybody thinks she's brilliant, and they all say how wonderful she is, and she takes care of her family, and she has her own business, and she's organized, and she's godly, and there's this kind of huge kind of thing where you're yay, I want to be like her. And two things that are great about that. One is that it's not kind of like the thing that's great about her is that she's pretty and she's like well behaved, but actually that she's kind of got her own mind and she works hard and she's looking after people and she's kind of bringing everybody, like all the things she's doing are kind of bringing blessing and kind of good report to all of the people who are involved around her. But also that actually it's kind of that she's, it's sort of a slightly unachievable thing, and yet in the kind of light of the whole Bible, and particularly in the light of Proverbs, which is all about wisdom and knowing God, that actually these kind of things are possible if we know God, and if we commit ourselves to a life that is good and in line with his kind of teaching and stuff, that actually this is a sort of picture of what life could be like. So basically, I want to say, I don't really see how that verse says that women are still objects. I just kind of think it's good. But maybe you want to disagree with me. I think we kind of are out of time, which is, so maybe you want to disagree with me afterwards, but I'm going to hand back over and he's going to say some stuff.